Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Media Marxism Podcast, the first ever episode of the Media Marxism Podcast, and the only ever episode of the Media Marxism Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about corporate propaganda, corporate censorship, and just generally how corporations, particularly in America, control so much of the media environment and public discourse. We'll be talking about what it is, how it works, the impacts it can have, as well as how you can identify and avoid it, to an extent at least. Particularly, I'm going to be talking about corporate propaganda as it pertains to military interventions and spending by the US government. This is obviously super relevant to the war in the Ukraine and how the United States is responding to that conflict, which is why I wanted to use it as a bit of a case study today. To get started on this topic, I want to look at a very easy to identify form of corporate propaganda just to help y'all get a feel for this stuff before diving into the more subtle forms of corporate propaganda. So on the screen here, we see an article from Politico titled "Saki, Russia Could at Any Point Launch an Attack in Ukraine" that was published on January 18th, so very much in the lead up to Russia's full invasion of Ukraine. And while the headline might sound like just a straight reporting of the facts, it's just them telling you what the White House press secretary said in a press briefing. Immediately to the right of the article is an advertisement for Lockheed Martin, one of the biggest defense contractors in the US. Now, this is an obvious conflict of interest because Lockheed Martin has a financial incentive to promoting war. War is how they make their money, after all, and it is fair to assume that Lockheed Martin's sponsorship of this article could have an impact on the content and the framing of this story. Authors and editors are much less likely to be critical of the military-industrial complex if their financial livelihoods depend on that same complex. And this isn't the only Politico article with Lockheed Martin advertising. If I come here and click on the National Security Daily link to today's article, you can see it has the same advertisements. And this isn't even the most obvious form of corporate propaganda through advertising by Politico. Here we can see an issue of this National Security Daily by Politico from last year during Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, a withdrawal that should be noted will cost Lockheed and other defense contractors millions of dollars. And at the top we see the line, presented by Lockheed Martin, making the fact that this is just corporate propaganda even more obvious. So obvious, in fact, that they removed that line after criticism on Twitter. Now, whether you want to call this corporate propaganda because they are essentially paying Politico to publish one-sided and favorable articles that at least appear respectable because they're in an established news outlet, or you want to call it censorship because they are preventing Politico and their authors from publishing articles critical of the military-industrial complex, under the threat of your funding will get pulled and you will not have a job. So it doesn't really matter. Either way, they're having a huge impact on the stories people are seeing about war, which has a huge impact on the public's acceptance of war. And if you have any doubts about that, I would direct you to the media's acceptance of the Bush administration's justifications of invading Iraq, i.e., weapons of mass destruction. So all of these turned out to be false and without any evidence even, but it was incredibly effective in getting the public to support the invasion that now a vast majority of Americans recognize as a complete mistake. So this leads me to the less obvious forms of corporate propaganda out there that are about war and war profiteering, because these political articles are just so obviously propaganda that most people can see right through it. However, the more hidden forms of corporate propaganda can be much more impactful and dangerous. So this is a screenshot of a YouTube video on the Secular Talk YouTube channel, which is run by the social democrat and very anti-war political commentator Kyle Kulinski, about how Fox News called the war in Ukraine AOC's war, referring to Congress spokesperson Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, no reasonable person watching this Fox News segment is going to believe the hosts here, but that's not actually what's important. There's actually a bunch of layers of deception and misdirection going on in this Fox News clip. First, and more tangentially related to the war in Ukraine, Fox News will just take any opportunity to blame problems on leftist politicians because that's just what they do. That's part of their larger conservative propaganda strategy that we don't have time to go into right now. But more importantly, this is just one instance of these hosts displaying their power. They can lie, they can say whatever they want, and it doesn't matter how absurd it is. They have been doing this for years, and they'll be back on the show tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year with no consequences for being wrong. If that doesn't scream, I'm in control of this narrative, I don't know what does. So this little segment also serves to distract both those they're trying to influence and those who would oppose them. So it distracts their intended audience because any time spent bashing AOC is time they don't have to spend actually thinking critically about the war in Ukraine and how the US government should respond and whether the government's current response is correct. And there's also some small portion of the audience that will actually believe it's AOC's war and spend their time being mad about that instead, but that's a small minority. Now, it also distracts those who would oppose their narrative because it essentially creates busy work. So this video that I'm showing by Kyle Kalinske is a great example of that. While this entire video isn't spent to explaining why these Fox hosts are just utterly wrong, some of it is. And that is time in this video that is spent not talking substantively about the issue at hand. And without this comment, without this segment on Fox News, this video may not have ever been made, and Kyle and other anti-war commentators could make other better videos, but they're just dragged into basically refuting these absurd claims because they feel like they have to. So in just one clip, we have propaganda as signaling and propaganda as distraction. Now you could also make the case that both of these are forms of censorship, but that's a topic for another time. And you can also be sure that corporate liberals on MSNBC and CNN are doing the same thing, but replace AOC with Trump or whatever the right-wing boogeyman is at the moment, because both of these sides are in the pocket of the military-industrial complex. And if you haven't read Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, please do, if you're interested in this at all, because it explains these dynamics so much better than I can. And I think this leads me into my final example in kind of the most establishment news outlet, the New York Times. Now, before I get into this, it should be noted that the New York Times aren't the only ones doing this, or they're not even the worst. See Politico for the worst, but they're just the example I want to use because they are one of the most respectable news outlets in the country. So on the screen, we see an article reporting on a meeting Zelensky had with US Congress members in which he is reported to ask for more jets and a no-fly zone. So what's this article doing? Well, again, we see the media appearing to act as stenographers. They're just reporting what happened in this meeting, right? Lending to their perceived credibility. They're just giving you straight facts. More importantly, however, they're using the mention of a no-fly zone to shift the Overton window towards more military support for Ukraine. Now, a no-fly zone is never going to happen. It is overwhelmingly opposed by leadership in the Congress and in the executive branch, and it would start World War III. But the media still won't stop talking about it. Why? Because if we should be implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, like Zelensky is asking for, but we can't, then the least we could do is send them more fighter jets. And by presenting the most extreme option as a real possibility, everything short of that appears even more reasonable, even if under normal circumstances it would be totally insane and not what anyone would want to do. Now, this isn't without consequences, though. This normalization of a no-fly zone has led to large swaths of the public to support it when they don't even know what it means. So a recent CBS and YouGov poll found that the majority of Americans support a no-fly zone. That is, until you tell them what it is, an act of war, at which point it completely flips. And why did Americans support a no-fly zone in the first place? They didn't know what it was in the first place, because it was talked about in the media in a wildly irresponsible way that wasn't to inform the public as to what a no-fly zone would mean for the conflict in Ukraine, but to shift the overton window towards military aid to Ukraine so people would accept sending them fighter jets, something our friends at Lockheed Martin would absolutely love. They want war. War is profitable. Alright, so what have we learned? And what do you do with this information? The biggest thing that I hope you take away from this is that corporate media is just another part of the political establishment. They are in bed with political and corporate leaders, and they are not here to inform the public. They're here to make as much money as possible for their owners, like Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post, which can often mean misinforming the public to keep advertisers happy or to increase the value of, say, defense stocks, because their owners, Jeff Bezos, also owns a lot of those. Sadly, there's no way to completely avoid this. These outlets are often the only ones with access to the people and the places that we need to investigate, that we need to go there, ask questions. But what we can do is be skeptical. Always ask yourself, what aren't they showing me? They're really good at making things appear objective, acting as stenographers, but what they're not telling you is everything they're leaving out that would run counter to what their narrative and their agenda. Beyond that, though, I would say seek out independent media outlets. Places like YouTube and Substack have a lot of great independent reporters and commentators who aren't beholden to advertisers or owners and are doing it because they're genuinely interested in giving their honest take on it. Now, there's also plenty of terrible political reporting and commentary on these platforms, so be careful. But if you can find people that you trust to be honest, not that you necessarily agree with them, but you trust that they don't have a hidden agenda, I found that they can be some of the best voices of reason in a broken establishment media landscape. Thank you for listening to this episode of Media Marxism. I've been Joshua King. Bye.